Well, the inspiration for the christening came from a dream that I had. I was actually working on another project at the time, and I fell asleep at my writing desk one night, and I had a dream that I was dreaming. So it was like having two dreams in parallel. And in that dream I found myself in Ireland, on the far side of the world where I'm originally from. And I was in a dark country lane. A storm had just blown through and everything was wet and soaking. And in that laneway I met a girl coming towards me, and she'd been through the storm and soaked through the skin. And in her arms she had a blanket, a new baby wrapped in the blanket. And her name was Kate, and she was running and she was terrified. And she started telling me her story. So in my dream I'm literally writing this down, page after page after page, where she'd come from, who she was, what had happened to her, where was the father. And when suddenly there was a roaring sound, and I thought it must be a hurricane. So from the first dream I brought back to the second dream, where I'm in my writing room again, and the whole house is starting to shake. So I ran outside to see what was going on, and it wasn't a hurricane, it was a Spitfire diving time and time again across the roof of my house. In fact, it was so low sometimes I had to duck down to miss it. But in the cockpit in the Spitfire, I could see the pilot looking back at me with a gaze of fierce determination. And on the cowling in front of the cockpit was an Irish shamrock, which was bizarre because back in those days the Irish and the British were enemies, so it didn't make sense to me why I was there. But I felt that the guy in the Spitfire was connected to the girl in the story. And I turned in my dream to ask her what this connection was. But then the phone rang, and I was awoken from my dream back to my writing room again. And it was 6 o'clock in the morning, the sun was shining, and it was a very good friend of mine on the phone. And I said, "G'day, how's it going?" And he said, I've got some bad news. I said, "What, we can't play golf today?" "No," he said, "I've got cancer." So I said, "Okay, man," I said, "I'll come down and see you." But an even bigger shock to me was when I put the phone down, I found on my table 33 pages of handwritten notes from the story of Kate back in Ireland. So I went to see my mate, and we were sitting around the table having a cup of tea. And on the table was a piece of A4 paper, and there was a bucket list written across the top of it. So I said to him, "Is this something to do with gardening? Can I help you here?" And he said, "No," he said, "this is a list of all the things I want to do before I die." And he said to me, "Gary," said, "don't wait for tragedy in your life before you write your bucket list." So I went home that evening and wrote my list, and I spent about 4 hours doing it. And there was about 100 items on the list, and the following day I had to go overseas, but I was away for so long that when I came back there was a message saying that my friend was now in a hospital. So I went to see my friend, and I was pretty shocked. He was in a very bad way. And he didn't greet me when I went into the room, he just lifted his hand up and said, "Did you make your bucket list?" And so I took it out and showed it to him. And on the list, the first 2 items were wealth creation and security for my family. And it was a long list, and the bottom last 3 things were write a book that helps people, sail around the world with my wife and kids, and make a movie. And my friend looked at the list and he said, "Gary," he said, "these 2 first items," he said, "this isn't living the dream," he said. "This is just being safe and secure." He said, "If you really want to live the dream," he said, "turn the list upside down and start at the bottom first. Write that book that helps people, sail around the world with your wife and kids, and make that movie." And he made me promise to do that. And it was a big promise to make. I mean, how can you deny your friend who's going to pass away? But afterwards I told my wife about it, and she'd been very moved with the experience, and she said, "Yeah, you know what, let's do this." So we did. We sold our house and everything we had, and we bought a boat, and we started sailing around the world. And our final destination was Muscat, which is the capital city of the Sultanate of Oman in the Middle East. And we spent a year at sea. When we arrived there, though, we had a stowaway on board. And it turns out that she was our 3rd child, who was inspiration for the very first early intervention centre for children with Down syndrome in that country. So my biggest challenge was connecting the guy in the Spitfire to the girl with the baby. And while Kate had told me about her story, it was almost unbelievable. It was too big. And then the most bizarre thing happened. A number of years later, I was in a little town market in Wales in the United Kingdom. And it's the usual little town market with bric-a-brac and cake stands and food stands, and there was a bookstall there. And I was going through the bookstall, curious to see how books had been written, and suddenly I came across this book here. And you can see in the front of the cover, the first name, it's Paddy. I mean, Paddy's synonymous with being Irish. And then I saw a fighter race. But what really drew my attention was that this is actually, it's a fighter pilot, and this is a Spitfire, and you can see in the front that there's a shamrock in the front. And I picked up and I started reading it. And suddenly I realized everything that Kate had told me was true. And where before it was unbelievable, now it was fantastic, and I'd made that connection, which meant I could go back and get the story completed. So why Guinness? Well, in the early draft I was talking about stout and porter, but really I had in my heart Guinness. And at the heart of every brand there's a great story that represents the passion and the spirit of what the brand represents. And to me, Guinness in a single word is Irish. I mean, the sons and daughters of Ireland who were raised in Guinness, they went forth and built the world. So when you drink a Guinness, you're suffering from the essence of what it means to be Irish. Things like daring, adventurous, courageous, resourceful, artful, talented, sophisticated, undiminished by adversity, but not so serious about life that you can't have a bit of crack along the way. And that's to me what the main characters in the story, Paddy and Kate, represent, and ultimately what the christening is all about. So who does the book appeal to? Well, my daughter was 15 years of age when I started writing the christening at the time, and I wanted it to be such a story that a 15-year-old could read it. So the war scenes are not graphic and the love scenes are not explicit. It's kind of like watching a 1940s movie. At the same time though, I wanted to remain authentic to the people who've lived through the war. So it meant I had to honour history. And probably the best example of that is recently a mum about our age, she bought the book and she read it. It took about 2 weeks. When she finished it, she gave it to her mother, who's 82 years of age. She took 2 days to read it and raved about it so much that her 15-year-old granddaughter picked it up and read the book as well. And they were sitting around the dinner table one night talking about the christening and raving about it when her father said, "I want to read this too," which he did. And when he was finished, he bought 2 copies for his friends who were in business. And I since got one of the best testimonies I've ever gotten for the christening from one of these friends. But the story really took off when I added music to it, because to me, I'm not going to say that it's a musical, but in the story Kate sings some beautiful songs. And when I started to add some modern music to this story, it really took off. And I think it's that modern music that goes through the essence of the story and what appeals to people nowadays. Guinness loved the big idea behind the story. Arthur Guinness, who was the founder of the company in the 17th century, was one of the early social philanthropists and supporter of worthy causes around the world. And the christening, that's what it's dedicated to. The profits of the book are dedicated to changing the attitude and the prejudice that prevails against children with Down syndrome around the world. This is very much in keeping with the Guinness philosophy of doing business and making positive change. Describe the christening in one word: unputdownable.